Around the Mediterranean Sea is a ring of ruin, still impressive remains of the vast Roman Empire. These remains suggest that great military campaigns brought them down. The fact, however, is that the Roman Empire was also weakened from the inside out, weakened by fractured beliefs and moral failure. Into that darkness shined the light of a letter from the Apostle Paul to the Romans. This is the land of the Bible, Israel, a land occupied for almost 300 years by the forces of Rome. The empire's influence is apparent in Israel's many Roman ruins, ruins like those of the coastal city of Caesarea, once an impressive port city modeled in part on the city of Rome. Caesarea was the administrative center of the occupied territory known to the Romans as Palestine. Day of Discovery's Mark D. Hahn and Jimmy DeYoung are in Caesarea to revisit some of the key issues raised by the collapse of the Roman realm and the rise of an unlikely movement, a movement made up of followers of Jesus Christ. How could the non-violent efforts of this new faith challenge the authority and beliefs of antiquity's greatest empire?
Always so enjoy coming here to the shores of the Mediterranean in Caesarea. Look at the variety of shells that you can find on the shores.
I was noticing back there too, there's a lot of pottery mixed in, little pieces of pottery. I think reflects the history of this spot, you know?
Yes.
And the reason that Jim and I have come here to Caesarea is to see remaining evidence of the strong relationship between the Caesars and Rome and the land of Israel in the times of the New Testament.
In fact, in 6 AD, Rome set this as the seat for the governors of the province of Judea. This was the headquarters for the 10th Roman Legion. The Jewish historian Josephus says that this was the largest port city along the Mediterranean coast on the eastern shore of that coast. And actually it became that after Herod the Great built the city in the 1st century before Jesus Christ, a great city in the Roman Empire.
And so by this time, the Holy Land had orbited into the Roman universe. At first they sent Roman governors there, but then the house of Herod came along, and they thought that Herod would be a good client king for them, meaning or acting like a Roman governor. So they let him be in charge, and by now then the house of Herod was in charge at the time of the birth of Jesus Christ.
Herod the Great's main palace was located in Jerusalem, but after he built this Roman city of Caesarea, he came here to the shores of the Mediterranean and built another palace. You can see framed into the bedrock what would have been the very decorative pool here at the palace at Caesarea. Had a lower floor and then the upper palace itself. And in the upper palace, in fact, there was a Jewish mikveh, a ritual bath. How appropriate. Rome had named Herod the Great the King of the Jews.
There's so many links here between Herod, Caesar, and the unfolding story of the Bible. Remember, Herod built Caesarea in honor of Caesar Augustus. It was by his census that Joseph and Mary came to Bethlehem for the birth of their son Jesus. It was the Herod who built this palace, who then in turn saw the birth of Jesus as a potential threat to his own kingdom.
Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Matthew chapter 2.
The conflict between Herod and Jesus was only a foreshadowing of the conflict between imperial Rome and the followers of the resurrected Christ. The stage was set for an unusual drama.
This theater was commissioned by Herod the Great just before the birth of Jesus Christ. It was for entertaining not only the Roman citizens, but the Roman soldiers that were stationed here. In fact, all across the Roman Empire is marked by public buildings, elaborate entertainment centers, like a hippodrome for a horse race or a chariot race, like the elaborate pools that were built here, even at Herod's palace. The entertainment provided by the Caesars and also Herod the Great, provision for the citizens of the Roman Empire.
Caesarea was not unique in the empire. The games and entertainment provided for people here and all over the Mediterranean region were modeled after Rome itself. And in Rome, the Colosseum was a virtual superdome of sports.
The Colosseum is the greatest circus in the Roman Empire, built in the 80s of the 1st century AD. So games were throughout the Roman Empire, and they have free admittance. And this was the way that the Latins say, panem et circensem. That means that the emperor gave food and games at the circus with free admittance. Even during the games, during the events at the circus, the emperor sometimes gave kind of credits to buy food to the people. And this was the way to keep happy the people and close to the emperor, because always in the Roman Empire there were the need to keep balance the authority between the Senate and the emperors.
The Colosseum was used as a safety valve for public aggressiveness, that people could somehow get rid of their aggressiveness, their rage, their anger, their dissatisfaction under control in a situation like that of the Colosseum, so that outside it would be easier to keep the social peace. Bred in the circus, the politics of entertainment, certainly using blood sports to channel the aggressiveness of the crowd.
I think most of the Roman people at the time were pretty appreciative of the governmental umbrella called the Roman Empire, simply because these were the people who hung up the traffic lights, so to speak. These are the people who had cleansed the Mediterranean Sea of pirates. These were the road builders. Really, lots worse things could happen to you in the ancient world than be conquered by Rome. We often get the wrong idea from so many novels and Hollywood movies where the Romans are pictured as rapacious destroyers. They rape the women, they burn down the cities, they take excessive taxation and get the people bereft of any property as a result. Not true. Now, to be sure, some of the bad emperors were terrible. But that really wasn't reflected too much on the common local level. You don't want to make war on Rome, because then you will get clobbered. Ask the Jews about that and the great insurrection of 66 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, that was no fun. I'm not trying to say that they weren't brutal, but I am trying to say that pretty well the taxation was comparatively mild. Say, I would rather pay Roman tribute as a Jew in the Holy Land than American income tax. Much rather. I'd come off much better.
In some ways, life in the Roman Empire was similar to life today. We pay our taxes and are provided the benefits of police protection and security. But in the Roman Empire, there was a big difference. When it came to spirituality, its gods held no ultimate answers for the ever-present evidence of human mortality, a reality even more stark then than now.
Let us not forget that the Romans live with death at their doorstep. The life expectancy of an ancient Roman at birth is 30. If he survives childhood, 40. Every Roman past 40, it has been said, is a survivor. And a lifetime spent with disease and epidemics, with war and crime at their doorstep, how can one expect people who live in such conditions and who don't have the inner support of ethics connected to the value of human existence and faith, how can one expect them to value life the way we know we should today? So I think that the ancient world is a violent place. It doesn't seem to me that the Greeks or the Persians valued life much more than the Romans did. It's a difficult world, a world in which life is worth nothing.
By the time it reached its zenith, the Roman Empire was providing unprecedented social and material services to its citizens. But instead of producing satisfaction, its bread, circuses, and enforced peace, its Pax Romana left a spiritual vacuum that its gods could not fill. Then, just at the right time, a message of hope, of true provision, was heard in the theater of despair.
We got something for you here. It's come a long way. I'm the courier of the day, all right?
Look at that. Looks like a scroll in a leather pouch. This is the book of Romans?
That's right.
When I think about the times of the Roman Empire, I still find it amazing that one letter would have such a profound impact that Rome and eventually the whole world would come under the influence of its message. When the truth of Jesus' death for all and his resurrection was revealed, it eventually changed the lives of millions all over the world. The good news of Jesus the Messiah transformed individuals one by one until the entire Roman Empire knew that there was a purpose in life that was greater than extreme games and daily food could provide.
The kind of theology that Paul sets out in Romans, as I think I would argue all New Testament theology does, is always countercultural. It's arguing that people need to realize the realities they see around them every day. Their social context, the political powers of empire for the Romans who were living in first century Rome, that these were not the ultimately significant realities, that there is a reality behind and above those realities that we discern spiritually.
The Apostle Paul's letter to Roman followers of Christ was countercultural, not only in pointing to benefits of greater significance than Caesar could provide, but also because it countered the pagan beliefs of the surrounding culture.
The centerpiece of St. Paul's letter to Rome, of course, will be chapter 3 and chapter 5, where he talks about how we get right with God, and the answer is God gets right with us through faith in terms of justification, which he himself gives us. That's the great news in the book of Romans.
Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Romans chapter 5.
The idea that God has done it for us in Christ at first would seem very strange to pagans or ex-pagan Christians, because the whole idea in Greco-Roman religion was to work for your salvation, to make sure that either the gods didn't see the sin you were doing, or if there was some bad sin, to try to make up for it, to try to work into a way of getting right with Zeus and the other gods. Christianity comes along and says, no, God has done it for us in Christ. And so if you can believe that, God in his incredible standard of justice, which is not only a passive standard, but an active one by which he imputes Jesus' righteousness to all of us. So that would have been a very foreign, but a very welcome concept to people who felt they had to climb up to heaven by their own efforts.